is a policy that you want to implement in the good times.
Free admission policy goes back a long, long time. People think about it as a relatively recent thing, and in its most recent iteration it is. But most national museums were free for decades. It was only in the economic problems in the 70s and 80s that charging was brought in for national museums. And most recently, an election manifesto pledged by our Labour Party in 1997, they said that they would do away with admission charges to museums as part of their policy on social inclusion. It was implemented by Tony Blair's Labour government in 2001, so it took a good 4 years between election and implementation. And to be fair, it was implemented slowly, so it was not a switch that was flicked. First of all, children went free, then other concessions before free admission in its entirety was brought in December 2001. One of the things that we were very keen to do with, and I'm wearing my NMDC hat now, one of the things that National Museum directors were very keen to do in the run-up to the last election was to get all the major political parties to pledge allegiance to free admission. And in fact, it was quite easy to get them to do that. But the reason to do it was, of course, that whatever colour of government was elected, we feel we had a commitment to the continuation of the policy, notwithstanding the enormous economic problems that, of course, all governments across Europe face at the moment, indeed perhaps even the wider world. So free museum policy actually was very much on the agenda during the election, and in fact the coalition agreement between the two ruling political parties in the UK actually mentioned free admission in the coalition document. So it's entrenched, and from our perspective that's a very good thing. I'm going to refer a little bit in this presentation to socioeconomics. I make no apologies for this. The whole rationale for the free admission policy was to allow social inclusion. It was to encourage people from lower socioeconomic groups in the UK to engage more with cultural activities. And at the time that the free admission policy was brought in, this is the system of social grade that was being used in the UK to denote social grade. One of the other things I want to talk about today in justifying the free admission policy is what I call the three-legged stool of National Museum funding. And museums sit on this stool with three legs, each of which are very important. First of all, museums need to be commercially entrepreneurial. So we need, in national museums, to generate as much of our own income as we possibly can from trading activities. I won't talk a lot about that today, except to say that one of the things that I've been very keen to do at the Natural History Museum in London is to really push our staff to be entrepreneurial, to think about ways that we can generate income. Right down to, for example, we license use of our brand, our trademark, our logo, to commercial bodies to produce products that sell in shops. So you can buy NHM branded dinosaur birthday cakes in supermarkets. You can buy NHM branded pajamas in Marks and Spencer. So these are ways that we use our brand and our expertise to generate income. Government funding, as you will see, is the thickest leg of the stool by a long way, but I'll come back to that later. And charitable giving is also very important. Now, the UK government is particularly keen now that national museums and other cultural institutions generate far more of their income from philanthropy, from charitable giving. Quite interestingly, even since I've been in Lisbon, in the last budget, our government said they were going to implement a new policy to cap the tax relief that wealthy people have on charitable donations to 1/4 of their annual income. Now, we were up in arms about this because at a time when we were being encouraged to generate more money from philanthropic giving, the government was putting a complete blanket over the top of that sort of giving. I'm very pleased to say that the power of our lobbying, not just museums but other charitable institutions too, the Chancellor announced the day before yesterday that we're going to do a U-turn on that policy, so that cap is now gone. But what I do want to observe is in the UK we regard all three of those sources of income as very important. And I think it's fair to say that, and I'm going to make very sweeping generalisation here, that in Europe there's perhaps a heavier reliance on government funding than, or historically there has been a heavier reliance on government funding than charitable giving and commercialism. In the United States, many of the big well-known institutions are very heavily dependent on philanthropy. Many of them exist on extremely large endowments, and of course in times of economic problem, those endowments are worth less in real terms, and the income that they generate annually falls. And certainly in the last 5 years, many American museums have got into difficulties because the value of those endowments and the return on those endowments has been a big problem for their operating costs. So let me just tell you a little bit about the Natural History Museum so you can get an idea of the scale of the operation and some of the issues that we face. We are the national collection of natural history objects, so we are a national museum, and those objects are held in trust for the nation, so they belong to the people. And that's a very important concept, because it means that our trustees cannot dispose of any of those objects because they're held in trust for the nation. It means that they are ultimately protected. Our annual turnover in revenue terms is about £80 million a year, and our government funding is just under 50 at the moment, but falling. Our government sets government funding a number of years ahead, and as part of an agreement with government, we know what our funding is scheduled to be until the end of 2014-15. And that's really quite important, because being able to plan ahead, museums are very long-term enterprises, so being able to plan ahead is incredibly important. And I fought very hard with government to say, actually, telling us what our budget is going to be only a year ahead is not really very useful. We need to be able to plan. This is probably quite hard to see what the arrows say, but I'm going to talk you through it. This is the plot of the moving annual total of visits to the museum, the Natural History Museum, since 1997. And you can see the first arrow moving from left to right is the point at which free admission to UK national museums or English national museums was introduced. And you can see over the first 12 months, visits rose incredibly. In fact, they went from about a steady state between 1.5 and 1.75 million to just about 3 million. But it then did fall back quite sharply by about 250,000. And our belief is that the free admission policy was so well promoted by the government and by the institutions themselves that there was a flood of people that came, and therefore the number that came in the next period after that first year did fall back somewhat. Buoyed by the additional numbers, we began to introduce all sorts of programmatic activities in the museums to try and improve those numbers. So, as you can see, over the next 2 years, we got back to about a steady state of about 3.25 million visitors. Then, as many of you may remember, there was a series of bombings in London in July 2005, and that had quite a big impact. A lot of people stayed away from London. As you can see, that's the third arrow. On visitor numbers fell back by about 250,000. Then again, a whole series of programmatic activities, changes in programme, temporary exhibitions, new things that we introduced in our public programme. We got up to about 3.75 million visitors, and it stayed there pretty much consistently over a 3-year period. Now, during that 3-year period, we were in the process of delivering the largest capital project in the museum since the museum was built in the 1880s, our Darwin Centre. And we actually thought, although it was a big new intervention and a very, very important new way for the museum to present its science, we actually thought that we'd get about an additional 500,000 visitors and then it would begin to fall back again. So we've been somewhat staggered by the fact that over the first year we got an additional 1 million visitors. You know what? It hasn't fallen back. In fact, we are still seeing an increase in visitors. As I said, we're now at a point where we are receiving about 5 million visitors a year. Now that may sound fantastic, but that comes with attendant problems. The museum wasn't designed for 5 million people a year. The fire load limit of the museum is about 11,000 people if they distribute themselves evenly. On our busy days, we're getting 25,000 people to the museum. So we can only let people into the museum after a certain point of the day at the rate that they're leaving. And that builds enormous queues. So on our worst day, it can take you an hour and a half of queuing to get into the museum, which is, in my view, completely unacceptable. So we've got work to do. One of the arguments that we used as a sector in the last government spending review, just after the last election, was, you know what, there was a boom in government expenditure over the last 10 years, but we weren't part of it. But look at what we've delivered. And the argument is based on this graph. The bottom line, the purple one, is the Natural History Museum's government funding over the period since 2002-03. Now it's expressed relative each year in percentage terms relative to that amount. So it normalises, if you like, all of the amounts of money involved here. So that's the museum funding. Now the blue line, which is the next one up on the right-hand side, is all UK government expenditure over that period. So you can see that museum funding only rose over the period by about half the rate of all government spend as a whole. So our argument to government was, at the last spending review, we weren't the beneficiaries of the boom in government expenditure over the last 10 years. So cutting us by the same amount as everyone else would be extremely unfair. I'm not sure that the reason I put this slide in is I used it in another presentation just to show that when you're in the middle of a capital project like delivering our Darwin Centre, the sources of your income are distorted. So this is our total income for the Natural History Museum, just broken up into 4 different amounts each year back to 2002-03. The blue is our government funding, grant and aid. The purple is our trading income. The yellow is our development income, our fundraising, and the little bit at the top is other income. We generate a certain amount of income from letting property and return on invested money. It's not very much nowadays, particularly as interest rates are so low. The point of this is to show that during the middle of a capital campaign, the percentage of government money does fall. Probably more relevant to show you this, and this is the difference in the proportion of our funding that comes from government at the beginning and end of the period. So this is back in 2002-03. The big slice, light blue, is government funding. The darker blue is our commercial income, our trading income. The grey is the other income, and the other is fundraising. So right back in 2002-03, that's what it looked like. So what you can see is actually over the 10-year period, 8-year period, government funding is reducing, and the 2 important things where we control our own destiny, fundraising and commercial, are growing. And it gives us a powerful argument, actually. Although there are 2 ways of looking at this. Although you can say the more successful we are in commercial and fundraising terms, the more government can say, okay, we can cut you even more. Actually, I take a different view. We go to government now with a very strong argument saying, we deserve to be supported because we are doing everything that we reasonably can to control our own destiny and to generate our own funding. And thus far, it's an argument that seems to be holding sway. Not sure how much longer I've got. One of the things I did want to talk about, but I'm debating now whether to show all of these slides because it might stifle some of the discussion that's coming. But there are lots of arguments in the UK as to why free admission is not a good thing, and it depends, of course, on your stance, where you come from. There are arguments like nobody would object to paying a very small amount of money to visit a National Museum. In fact, we've got evidence based on the introduction of charging twice previously that suggests that's a complete fallacy. I'll come back to that. One of the great things about being an island nation is that our attitude to foreigners is not as healthy as it might be. So lots of people say, why should UK taxpayers subsidise overseas visitors to our museums? Some of our national museums, like the British Museum, about 70% of their visitors come from overseas. So you can see some sympathy, perhaps, for that argument. We've certainly seen at the Natural History Museum an increase in the number of overseas visitors. It used to be under 40% of our total audience. In the last 6 months, it's been more like 60% of our audience. So there's something interesting going on about the strength of sterling versus convertible currencies, and the fact that the UK is perceived to be a cheap or cheaper place to go at the moment than it has been for some time. There is an argument that the people that benefit most would come anyway and they would pay, and that's a frequently used argument. That free admission hasn't really benefited social inclusion. It's used a lot. In fact, I think it's fair to say on that one that the argument that social inclusion has improved only as the result of free admission policy is very difficult to justify. And some people say, well, high levels of government subsidy into these great institutions is actually unfair competition to other players in the visitor attraction market. So why should government support these institutions when fully commercial visitor attractions don't enjoy the same sort of benefits? I'm going to skate very quickly through some of the counters to those arguments in the hope that it doesn't completely stifle the conversation we're going to have on the panel shortly. Just the evidence on people would pay a small amount of money. In 1974, turnstiles were installed at the Natural History Museum at the cost of 10 pence. Now 10 pence is worth actually about just under 90p today, so a trivial amount of money. Attendance halved overnight, and in fact it was such a dramatic fall that policy was done away with within 3 months. Within 3 months, charging was abolished again. And in 1987, the same thing happened. Real pressure on government funding. A £2.50 charge was introduced then. And that's equivalent to about just under £6 today. And the same thing happened. The attendance halved overnight, but in fact, the government policy then was not going to be reversed. In fact, that charging regime stayed in place until 2001, so for 14 years. So the argument that people wouldn't mind paying a small amount, I think, is a spurious one. I think there's enough evidence in the UK and elsewhere suggests that is just not true. UK taxpayers shouldn't subsidise visitors from overseas. Well, yeah, quite an interesting one. However, 85% of foreign visitors to the UK say that the primary reason for their visit is to visit a heritage attraction or a museum. So that's pretty compelling for the importance of the heritage sector and museums in the UK tourist economy. In fact, we've calculated that there are about 7 million additional overseas visits to London's national museums now compared to the days of charging. We know that overseas visitors to the UK spend about £90 a day in the UK. So there's an argument that we can make about the contribution that museums make to the tourist economy of London and therefore the UK. In fact, our argument is that over the 8-year period, we're generating through our activities an additional £650 million worth of inbound tourist income. And that is quite interesting when you look at the cost of introducing the pre-admission policy, which in 2002-03 was £45 million, probably equates to something near £60 million now. And of course we are being cut. And we make a very strong argument that if you cut national museums, if you cut other heritage sites in terms of their government subsidy, our ability to attract overseas visitors will over time be compromised, and you're throwing away potentially a lot of inbound tourist income. People that would benefit would come even if they had to pay. Actually, I think there is some truth in this. However, the growth in the population of UK adults visiting museums, as you saw from the Taking Part survey, has gone up. So visitors numbers are up in all categories. And because museums have planned events, programs of activities that reflect a desire to attract people from both different socio-economic groups and different ethnic groups, we have seen growth in audiences from those areas. But that's arguably not because of free admission. Social inclusion is quite an interesting one, and this goes back to the ABC1, C2DE. So in the UK population, it's roughly half and half into those two groups. And if you looked at museum attendance, and we sample a certain number of visitors every month with a marketing questionnaire. So if you look in the run-up to free admission, which is the point of the arrow, we were getting somewhere between 75 and 80% of our visitors from the higher social groups. What's quite interesting is it went up very sharply in the first year of free admission, which suggests that the people who really saw the benefit of free admission initially were people who were our historic visitors. What's quite interesting, in the 2 years that followed, it's arguable whether that was free admission or our policy of new programming and events actually drove this. We did see a very sharp increase in attendance from people from lower socio-economic groups. Now that is true for the Natural History Museum. I think it would be very fair to say that that's not true for all sorts of museums. Certainly the fine art, contemporary art, museums of that sort did not see the same impact. And finally, we've done some economic studies at the Natural History Museum that suggests actually there is an economic benefit from the government investment in the museum itself. I actually recruited an economist from the London School of Economics to do some work for us, and he came up after a very long study with a stunning statistic that for every £1 of investment in the Natural History Museum government money, it generates about £4.50 in the wider economy. So although we don't see the benefit of that in our own profit and loss statement, our own financial results, what we need to do is make the economic argument to our government that actually making that investment does have an impact, but you can't see it because it's elsewhere. So what are my conclusions? I mean, free admission has certainly expanded our audiences. I think it has diversified our audiences, but not as much as perhaps the government would have liked. The overall cost of introducing that policy in 2002-03 of £45 million is actually dwarfed by the additional revenue that flows to the UK, though not necessarily through national museums. The growth in museum attendance, this is quite a subtle point, but the growth in attendance has enabled us to be much more confident about what we are as a sector. We can go out and fundraise much more effectively with an organisation that receives 5 million people a year than one that receives £1.5 million a year. So our ability to fundraise and take on big projects. So we've delivered a Darwin Centre at £78 million of investment. The British Museum has done the Great Court, £100 million. Tate Modern has been built. There's an enormous extension to Tate Modern being built now. Most of the large national museums in the UK have really improved their facilities over the 10-year period. And it's about having the confidence of greater audience. What we have seen is those audiences have actually been achieved on what is now falling government investment in real terms. So I think we can now stand up and face the government in the eye and say, you know what, we've done all of this and we're achieving objective of lower government investment. And the last one is a kind of subtle point. My youngest son, is 12. When I talk to him about museums, he has a totally different view about what the word museum means, what I did when I was his age. And I think that's a really important point. When I was 12, a museum was a place that was dark, it was cold, there weren't many people there were cabinets and stuff in, and there wasn't much happening. And but it's up to us as a community to of museums across the world, I think, to persuade our governments that actually museums are worth investing in, worth investing in high levels of government subsidy because they actually generate income for the wider economy. But we've got to get better at making those arguments.